Hi, I'm Jim Tankersley. I'm an economic policy correspondent for the Washington Post. Thanks so much for joining us here for just an incredible group of people on this stage. We are here to talk about Greater Washington and its global future, which seems like a sort of a funny thing to talk about in a place where we're right next to to the Canadian Embassy and Capitol Hill. I mean, we seem very globalized here in D.C., but the opportunities clearly for the economy are large, particularly in terms of economic diversification, something that the region has been talking about for a long time, but looking, I think, ever more important for it to actually achieve in the years and decades to come. I'm really pleased to be joined by just an incredible group of people, and I'm going to go down from my left here. We have Stephen Knapp, the president of the George Washington University, Anthony Pierce, who's a partner at Aiken Gump and the chair of the Greater Washington Board of Trade, Jay Knox Singleton, the CEO of Innova Health System, and Robert Patton, president and CEO of Patton Electronics. Thank you all for joining us. I'll start with just a general question to the group, and we'll take your questions at the end, but I just want to have a conversation and get you all talking to each other as much as anything. Let's start with that diversification question. We've been hearing for a long time about how important it is for the D.C. area to wean itself from federal spending as its primary driver of economic growth. We've seen in the last couple of years the dangers of not doing that as much as we'd like to. GDP growth has been basically flat in D.C. As the sequester has bitten in ways that it hasn't bitten almost anywhere else in the country. So I'll throw it out to all of you. What are the opportunities and how do we actually make them happen this time around for D.C. to become that more diversified, globalized, dynamic economic region? Go ahead. We'll go first.
Well, one of the things I think that would be very helpful from my position as chair of the Board of Trade is to reduce the competition that we have amongst the regions and kind of speak as one voice. And that's one of the things I really like about the Global Cities Initiative, because what it does is it focuses us externally on what we can be doing that would affect all the companies and all the businesses regionally in the community, no matter what industry you're in. So I think a more collaborative effort, which is something the Board of Trade has been pushing for years, amongst the business community, amongst the governments, I think would be very helpful in telling what is a really positive story about Washington's economy, separate from the federal government.
I was just going to say, I might add to that, I think it's actually a blessing that we have this disruption in the 50-year upward trend of ever greater expenditures from the federal government, because I think up until now there's been no necessity to sort of think outside the box about where do we look. And I think the point about looking outward is the core strategy. That a global opportunity is inherently more unifying, as you mentioned, than a domestic one. For some reason, luring business from Wichita to Washington is a competitive game. Somehow building ties with Japan or South Africa or Pakistan is not. And I think it is that space that holds the opportunity for more unity, although regional dysfunction probably will not be wished away entirely.
So I think Knox made a great point about how the current situation is forcing us to look at diversification in a way we not only didn't have the incentive to do, but actually had the reverse. Because I've had multiple conversations with executives who have frankly said that they need to keep their eyes focused on their customer, and by their customer they meant the federal government, and therefore they weren't interested in doing things like, for example, partnering with universities in new ventures, being entrepreneurial, being interested in technology transfer, taking some of the intellectual property and doing something with it, because they didn't want to take their eye off the ball as they saw it and jeopardize their relationship with their federal customer. Now that they're forced to do that, I think it's going to have a salutary effect. So I think that Knox's point is very apt. And what I would say we need to do is be much more systematic in aligning what employers are looking for from educational institutions, and that's all the way up and down the line of education, all the sectors of education, and being much more strategic about forming partnerships between our university communities and industry, and between the public and private sectors. We've done a little bit of that, but it's never really panned out, I think, largely because of that rather rigid focus on one large customer.
Right.
Well, I think the biggest issue, especially for small and medium business like mine, is fear of the unknown, right? And so there are just thousands of companies around the Beltway that are doing very similar business to mine, very focused on serving the federal government, and they have no appreciation or understanding for how the export markets work, how to get into them. They don't know how to go to market, and they don't know what kind of risks lie on the other side of the ocean, and so they just don't pursue it. So just having the ability to communicate that it is possible, and holding up examples where it is working, I think is going to be a good benefit to the people who are already doing things that are exportable. My company, we manufacture telecommunications equipment. There are lots of electronic assembly houses around the Beltway. None of them are exporting to any degree. 70% of my revenue is coming from outside the U.S.
One more sort of foundational question. I mean, you guys have very quickly cut to some of the challenges facing the region, regional coordination in particular, but also that sort of presence of the government that is both a boon to the economy and also maybe a little bit myopic in the way that it focuses businesses. But what are the strengths? What are the things that the region has that might be positioning it well to do well?
You want to take that sector by sector? I mean, I can.
Yeah, please.
So I'll
Let's
start.
get nerdy,
Let
man.
me start with universities. I'm here in actually two roles. First, I want to say I'm really grateful to JPMorgan Chase and to Brookings for both stimulating and guiding us into this process here. And also, I think it's really extraordinary the generosity of people who come from other regions to share their experience with us is a really generous and I think very helpful to all of us here to have those examples. And of course, we heard a lot about the role of universities in the regions in the last panel there. Well, let me say a little about universities here. So I'm here in two capacities. First of all, I'm chair of the Consortium of Universities of Metropolitan Washington, and that's 14 institutions whose combined population amounts to 250,000 students. And I was talking, we have Professor Steve Fuller here, who's a real expert on our regional economy here. He's from the faculty member at George Mason University. One of our consortium members was saying that if you went beyond the consortium to all the college universities in this region, it's something like 400,000 students. So it's a huge critical mass of talent that we have here in our educational sector. I'm also here as the president of George Washington University, which at the height of the recession invested $300 million in a science and engineering building, and did that with an eye toward precisely being a larger player in the diversification and development of this economy. We also happen to house a consortium of universities under what's called the I-Corps program of the National Science Foundation. So on our campus, we house a consortium that includes Johns Hopkins, the University of Maryland College Park, and Virginia Tech. And what the I-Corps involves is a methodology of engaging faculty members and being much more entrepreneurial by putting them through a boot camp approach in which they are required over a 6-week period to have conversations with 100 customers they identify for their inventions. We also brought a new biomedical engineering chair to campus, whose name is Igor Efimov, came to us from Washington University, St. Louis. He's just developed a program called Regulatory Biomedical Engineering, and the whole purpose of that program is to get biomedical engineers interested in intellectual property as part of the way they think about their activities. So we're trying to drive this entrepreneurial culture all throughout our universities, starting with some core faculty members who traditionally would not have thought in these terms, would not have thought about customers, would not have thought about partnering with industry. And I think if we can take that model and expand it to all the universities in the consortium and beyond, the consortium itself is eager to be a player in this Global Cities effort. And we actually have the president of the consortium, Dr. John Kavanaugh, is here today. And I think that's another sign of how interested we are in doing this. So I think that's a real strength, that's a real asset that has been underutilized in this region for many years. There are a lot of reasons for that, which we could go into if anyone's interested, but I also like to look at the future, and I think we can pull together a very powerful effort, and the universities can really help drive it, and they'll certainly benefit from that enterprise.
I think probably the two greatest assets that we have are, one, that the Washington region is a millennial magnet. You're seeing a steady influx of the well-educated, entrepreneurial, younger class who are really disproportionately the inventors and creators. And speaking of sort of area, economist Richard Florida argues that whoever wins the battle for the creative class really will win the economic competition. And I think we're one of a dozen magnet locations, and regrettably, it is tough if you were outside of a major metropolitan area with the appeal of a place like Washington to compete for the intellectual talent. And the future really belongs in this knowledge worker industry. And if you can't really attract knowledge workers, and we are able to, so we have I think a real advantage. The other is that while we're the home of a lot of global connections around the embassies and the traditional governmental connection points, as a practical matter, we've used that to a very limited extent, in my opinion, to leverage private connections off of those public connections. And yet, nearly all the embassies view part of their mission as being economic development or serving a role of the connector. And yet, because the federal market has been so strong, no one's really needed, perhaps, to work that connection. But I think we have a network that has not been really brought to life.
Just a quick interjection from an industry that I hold dear. To Knox's point, there are 10,000 fewer journalism jobs today in the broad United States of America than there were a decade ago. In Washington, there are twice as many as there were a decade ago. It's 1,000 more. So that shows in part some of that magnetization, industry consolidation that might very well favor the region if the region can capitalize. Anyway, Tony, did you have thoughts?
When you said industry sectors, I was going to say, well, we got a lot of great lawyers, but probably get left out of the room, although I know a few where they can go. Just to echo what they said, I think the talent pool here is tremendous of people, whether it's millennials or old guys like me. We have a tremendous amount of talent here that can, brain power that can get a lot of great work done. The other thing I think I'd say is that we have some industries here that people don't often think about, right? You just mentioned one, media. You know, we have Discovery, we have National Geographic, we have a lot of industries in the media game that are really power players in that industry. Knox is at a healthcare entity. We've got some great healthcare companies here, MedStar, Innova, you name them. We are probably a center of great growth and initiative in the healthcare area. Two others that I'll mention. One is hospitality. You know, we've become a bit of a hospitality magnet. Marriott's been here forever, but Hilton chose to locate here, and Choice Hotels is here, and there are others. So I think telling that story about what's already here, in addition to the great universities, the international interests that's here because the embassies are all here and their top diplomats are here. I think telling that story more will be very helpful because we do have all of these strengths, and I think sometimes the story doesn't get told well enough.
I'm interested, Bob, about tech because
Yeah.
I've written a little bit about this. There's this question of, there are a lot of tech workers in the area, and at what point does Washington, the region, become like a magnet that actually attracts people in the same way? I mean, not the same way, but in similar ways to Austin or Seattle or obviously Silicon Valley. Have we reached that point yet?
I think one of the big problems we have is that so much of the research and the work that's being done here you can't talk about.
Right.
And so there's a whole lot of sexy activity going on out there that just nobody knows. But if we can get this technology into commercialized form, it is sexy, and it would attract a lot of talented IT workers to stay in this area. So I think, you know, freeing up the ability to talk about some of the capabilities and the things that we're able to do in the region is big. And we've got virtually every tech sector covered. We got cybersecurity, information technology, telecommunications. These are all hubs in this region. So.
Yep.
So let me just give one example that I think might be of some interest, is something that Knox and his institution and our institution are both doing sort of in parallel right now, and that's investing in what's called personalized medicine, popularly known as that. It's using genomics information to figure out what treatments will work in individual patients. We've just invested in a major big data center on our Virginia Science and Technology campus, which is in Loudoun County. It was earlier mentioned that 70% of internet traffic flows through that county. We're right there. We're actually investing in 3 different data centers, big data centers. We're going to do some work in cybersecurity there as well. But we brought in a scientist named Keith Crandall, who's an expert in what's called computational biology, to kind of spearhead that. And again, I know that Knox has a major effort underway at Inova along the same lines. And that's a case where, the focus on healthcare and the availability of data are resources that I think we can really capitalize on, and it doesn't cross the line in terms of the top secret work that many of our institutions are involved in, which we can't necessarily export. The other point that I think, Knox, I just want to highlight this point about the embassies and the fact that we are a global magnet as a city, not just for talent, but for visitors from around the world. When Eric Spiegel, who is the CEO of Siemens USA, made a conscious choice to move his headquarters from New York to New Jersey Avenue, across from the Capitol, I once asked him why he made that choice, and his answer was that if he's in New York, he still has to travel around the world to visit his partners and his fellow CEOs. If he's in Washington, everybody comes to Washington. And I think this idea of leveraging that reality, and a lot of that has to do with the fact that the best diplomats in every nation of the world spend some part of their career right here in Washington. Many of them go on to become either foreign ministers or finance ministers of their countries. To use that to help provide access to private opportunities, as Knox suggested, I think is an untapped resource for us. We have not been strategic in the way we make use of that diplomatic connection here for our industries. And the final point about, and this was made by Amy, and I think it's a really good point, we bring one of the ways in which we export is through the people that we bring to this city who actually spend a good deal of their resources here. So if we can expand the number of international students, as we're doing as part of a very conscious strategic plan, we're actually adding resources here, and that itself is a form of export. And drawing patients from around the world to our medical institutions, drawing students is another kind of export that I think we can capitalize on here, because we're already on everyone's itinerary. And what does it mean to be a city that's on everybody's itinerary when they come to the United States? I think that's a tremendous advantage.
Now, I want to get back to personalized medicine in just a second, but I want to stick with the sort of global theme for a minute with Tony. Can you tell us about, you were on the board, you advised the Olympic bid. And
Yes.
so what did you learn from that about how the rest of the world sees Washington and its strengths and weaknesses?
I got to tell the truth?
Yeah. We're on the record.
No, I was on the Washington 2024 board, and also we did all the legal work for the effort. So, one of the things that, well, there are a number of things that I think were really good about that we learned. One, we learned that we could act regionally. And that was a great surprise to me, because everyone got behind that. We had the business community, we had the elected leaders, we had the federal government supporting us to some extent. So the notion that we cannot act regionally and come together as a business community and different governmental jurisdictions is not accurate, because that's an example of how we did it. The other thing that I learned is that to get that regional activity, and this may sound a little negative, but everybody's got to have some skin in the game. And what attracted all of the attention for that and the success, success not defined by not getting picked. Success defined as putting together what I think was the best plan that the USOC had to look amongst itself, is that, every jurisdiction had something to get out of it. So, for example, we were going to have an aquatic center built in Arlington. We were going to do equestrian races out of Great Meadows in Loudoun County. We were going to transform the RFK site. Olympic Village would have been there. We were going to transform the Anacostia waterfront, a huge data center where the old Pepco power plant is right now. In Maryland, we were going to do sailing, right? We were going to do the whitewater rafting further up in the state. It was, everyone got a sense of hey, there's something in this for me. And so what, I'm going to wrap this up, what is good about this initiative is I think the same thing holds true. We're all going to be talking about the region, and every part of the region is going to have a role in it if we are successful at doing this.
Right. Now, on these questions, timing can be everything. And Knox, I think that brings us back to personalized medicine. I know Inova had looked at something similar to this a while back and ended up not doing it then, and now you're pushing forward with it. What's changed? What happened in the timing that made you think this is the right time?
Well, to steal a line from Dostoevsky, it's the best of times, it's the worst of times. In healthcare right now, it's if you're in a blue state, if you're in a red state that doesn't extend Medicare, Medicaid as part of the Affordable Care Act, you're in the worst of times, because the economics in the core healthcare enterprise for doctors and hospitals and just about everybody else is really, in that context, is really bad. But out of the Affordable Care Act came another change which is going to shift, I believe, over the next 10 years, the core economic model in healthcare from basically fee-for-service to more of paying for health and quality outcomes. And then with an economic model that's moving in that direction, and then the emergence of genomic science and big data, which combined allow you to predict in many instances what future health risks lie embedded in your genetic map. Those two things, the idea of, for the first time, prospect of getting paid to keep people healthy and out of the hospital and away from the doctor's office, and simultaneously the ability to prospectively dodge some of these bullets around cancer and heart disease and everything in between, that is a whole new paradigm. And I think those two things happening at the same time really created both a carrot to lead that paradigm shift and a stick to say, if you try to stick with the old science, which is still characterizing the vast majority of the economic reward structure, you're going to be missing a great opportunity to serve the community and really change people's health in a positive way. So there was both a carrot and a stick. I'm not sure it was some eureka in the middle of the night, but it is clearly where the economic opportunities lie, and I think at Inova that leading that process is going to be a lot like the way that discovering the germ theory changed infectious diseases. You don't have to look back that far to we were bleeding presidents when they got hurt. And the leech business will never be the same again. But it's a whole new paradigm, and I think we have the opportunity. There is interest in the universities in that regard, and more importantly, I would say there's interest in many of the technology companies that are currently engaged in sort of related areas, particularly in some of the high-tech, big data areas of predictive medicine. That's a very transferable knowledge base, and we think it's a right in the middle of the bullseye for not just Inova and the people we're trying to serve, but really the region as a whole.
Right. Now, Bob, is this something where there needs to be more policy levers pulled to help tech get involved, either with these types of new initiatives or with just exports in general? Are there new carrots and sticks that need to be out there?
Yeah, carrots probably. Motivation of business is where's the profit, where's the opportunity, where's the revenue, and I think that's been one of the issues that we've had with almost every other type of economic development activity that I've been engaged in, is that so often we all gather together, and the people that are in the room are the same people that were in the room a month ago. There's no new opportunities being created, no new networks being created, and it becomes an echo chamber. And most of the people in the room only have local interests. So when I go and I go to some economic development activity, there's insurance companies and bankers and management consultants and all these guys that are trying to sell me something, and nobody that's trying to help me move my business and grow my business outside of the current structure.
Right.
So.
Now, President Knapp, in a lot of regions, we see universities emerging as exactly that sort of connective tissue, the kind of place from which new ideas spring and new people come who become the leaders in movements in new industries. Are there policy changes that DC needs for more of that to happen?
You know, I don't actually think it's a matter of policy changes. There are some oddities in DC in the way it approaches universities. For example, it's always surprising to people to hear that we have a cap on enrollment on all of our campuses. I mean, you take every university in the District of Columbia has a campus plan that dictates the number of students it can have and even the number of employees it can have. It's the only city I've ever lived in where you try to have fewer employees in the neighborhoods, and I think that's a bit of a constraint on us. And if that were lifted, we could expand the kinds of graduate student force that would actually help to spur a lot more innovation, because this generation of graduate students and young faculty that are coming to our university and all the other universities here do have an entrepreneurial interest that their forebears really weren't that much attracted to. They really want to get their ideas out into the marketplace in a very aggressive way, and we're held back a little bit. So that's the biggest policy change. That doesn't apply to the whole region. I don't think that exists in Virginia or Maryland. At least I never experienced it there, but it certainly exists here. This pressure to kind of keep a lid on the size of your workforce and the size of the student bodies here in order to preserve, the calm and peace in the neighborhoods. I think if we can kind of be a little bit more relaxed in that regard, that would actually help spur greater innovation coming out of Washington, D.C. itself, which, by the way, does have its own growing tech sector here.
So a sort of broad question now out for all four of you. We've talked a lot about different strategies and different planning possibilities here, but I'm wondering if this has to be planned. Is this something we're just setting the rules and letting the market find the best opportunities will naturally open up the region like we're talking about, or if there needs to be some sort of driving cooperative effort that sets the terms of what's going to happen?
So I'll let others speak, but I would say, is going back to something I mentioned earlier, I think planning is essential, because what we don't have is alignment. We have just kind of random conjunctions, but we do not have alignment across all the stages of education. Those are not lined up with the needs of industry. We haven't strategically identified industries that we want to develop here. One of the ones I would focus on is cybersecurity. We now, just as of this year, house on our campus, under the leadership of a woman named Diana Burley, who's an expert on the cybersecurity workforce, a consortium of 26 universities and 5 federal laboratories that are aimed at increasing the size of the cybersecurity workforce, which is in tremendous demand right now. But we've never had strategic discussions with industry here about how to bring about a focus on cybersecurity that is region-wide. And I think that's an area where planning would be really helpful. I think just a laissez-faire approach is not going to drive this not going to drive it forward with the kind of rapidity that I think we really need.
No?
I might take a little different tact, because I'd like to pick up on the point you made about the Olympic effort. I really think that the thing that's missing right now is the notion of a vision for the global character and the possibility for what Washington could be in terms of global terms. And the old saw about until everyone sort of brought together a vision of what we could do, and that was in getting an Olympic bid. But someone had to put forward the idea. Someone had to put forward the possibility definition. And then once that vision was articulated, then folks could come in behind it and probably at some point get around to thinking about what are the critical pieces that would make it happen. Like in a global vision, I think part of the issue is that universities are not particularly nurtured in virtually most places in the region. In fact, they're burdened with, at least in Virginia, with chronic reductions and underfunding in DC for just a whole bunch of things that stifle the growth of the tremendous resources there. But with a vision, I think then the drivers of that vision will sort of naturally percolate up. And I think the business community is the one thing that translates across the river, so to speak, and across the jurisdictional boundaries. And it's the entity that I think it needs to be the hub, because there will be a whole bunch of folks who want to do business with that core business once the global vision is articulated. But in the absence of that possibility set, and then in the process of the possibility set, people will start saying, well, what are the drivers? You know, what are you going to have to do to redevelop the RFK site or revitalize the Anacostia waterfront? I mean, what do you have to do? And I think issues around higher education, workforce, other policy drivers will percolate up. It's tough, I think, for a lot of the enabling entities like universities to articulate their own needs because they come across as so self-interested. But business can say, hey, the great research universities are the lifeblood of what we want to do. We've got to take better care of them, or whatever the equation is. So I think there is a place for someone to paint a possibility picture and articulate what are the pieces that will benefit all of us collectively.
And Jim, I just add, I definitely think to get that vision, it is going to require some planning and some organization and participation by the top business leaders in the region. And I think that can happen under whatever organization we decide that to happen to. If that's the Board of Trade, that's a great thing. But the one thing I would add to what was said so far is we also need to measure it and to have a result. That's why the planning is necessary, because I think you can't do anything unless you can measure it and know that you had a good result. And I think most of the people in this region are very result-oriented. So as we plan something, as we participate in this initiative, if we decide that we're going to do that, one of the key things will be to have some performance measurements to see that we're being successful with our result.
I would say that the region needs an identity. And so, you know, having a strategy is really about describing who we are and what we do as a region, and being able to identify each of these organizations that are in this region, that they have a role in the ecosystem. So knowing what the ecosystem is, knowing what the community is, knowing what we're all about and trying to accomplish, I think has to be drawn out of this process. Then companies can find their roles, and then students that are coming out of school can have a vision for what they want to do and how they want to play in the ecosystem. And I think just having that identity clearly described will play a major role in getting things moving.
I would say that as someone who spends a lot of time watching presidential candidates right now, the region has a bit of an identity in the country. That identity is supervillain. And it's something that's going to have to, if you want to change the economic dynamics of the region, is going to have to be
And
worked.
Jim, that's not just a domestic identity. To some, that's an international identity too.
That's right.
And it doesn't talk about the biggest part of the region. I mean, we are not just the 535 plus one, right? We are a bunch of communities, a bunch of businesses, a bunch of elected executives and politicians and jurisdictions. We're not just the federal government and what it does overseas.
Right. All right, so we're going to take some questions from the audience now. If folks have some, maybe we'll start way in the back over there.
Hi, my name is Patrick McEnany. I work for a company called 1776. We're a startup incubator here in the DC area. We've talked a lot about kind of the different assets the DC area has, right? Embassies, universities, industry clusters, a young, talented workforce. But I also wonder, if we could talk a little bit about the sort of skills that our workforce has here that can potentially be repurposed and reutilized in new ways to actually compete in the 21st century. And the example that we focus on at 1776 is a concept that we call regulatory hacking, right? Which is essentially, if you look at kind of probably say is the hottest startup in the country right now, which is Uber, they have run into a whole series of complications that the last generation of Silicon Valley startups didn't have, right? When you're a Facebook or an Instagram and people are just playing on their phones, you're not really dealing with a lot of complex regulations. You're not dealing with physical movement of goods or people. You're not dealing with kind of an established, entrenched incumbent like the taxi cab commissions who are trying to push back on you. And I think something that's so interesting that we've seen is how Uber, as they've expanded outside of Silicon Valley and they've had to deal with a lot of the pushback they've gotten in local cities and overseas, they've started to realize that they have to come up with a whole strategy to kind of hack the system and figure out how they can expand their business, which is obviously a really new business concept.
Sorry, can you get to your question?
Yeah, sure.
please?
I'm getting to it right now. So the point is that they had to hire a whole team of public affairs experts here in DC, right, including David Plouffe, Obama's former campaign manager, to help them navigate, not just in the US, but all around the world, how they can actually get regulations passed in their favor to expand. So I wonder if that's an example of, are there ways that we can take all the lawyers, all the political experts, all the people here in DC that we think aren't connected to innovation, aren't connected to future 21st century trading economies, and actually repurpose the skills that they have so that DC can compete in the 21st century?
Should we have the lawyer take that one?
Well, my answer to that is that to a great extent, that's happening here all the time. If you go to any law firm in the city, they have people who are going overseas helping either overseas companies come here or U.S. companies go overseas. And I do not, as a lawyer, like the word hack, but to regulatorily hack those jurisdictions to find out how to do business in the most effective way without getting in trouble with things like the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act and all kinds of other regulatory aspects. The sharing economy that you just talked about with as Uber as an example is a classic example of new tech pushing against old tech. Another great example of it is the Airbnbs and HomeAways of the world, who are being very disruptive in the hotel business. In terms of what we're talking about today, though, each one of those, that hacking that you're talking about is happening right now. And I mean, I would love to figure out a way to export it more, but I would push back on you and say that it is getting exported as we speak. And maybe we're just not telling that story well.
So I'll give a concrete example of exporting exactly what you're talking about. So we created a law school in India at IIT Kharagpur, which is entirely focused on intellectual property. So it's our intellectual property law faculty establishing an institution, exporting an institution, in effect, that will help India develop the intellectual property systems that it needs in order to be, reliable target of investment. So that's one example of this kind of thing. I think there's a lot more of that we can do. I think we have the talent and the expertise that we've developed here, which can be a global asset as well as an asset to companies that want to operate in this complex region here. So I think a lot of that kind of interchange is happening, as already been said. But more of it certainly we could develop, and we could be much more conscious about exporting that kind of intellectual expertise really around the world.
Okay, we'll take a question from over here if there is one. Yes, sir. Right there.
Hi, very interesting. I'm Fred Altman, and my question is, how much of a drag in terms of infrastructure are the governments? For example, dumping 95 traffic on the Beltway, not building an outer Beltway, the condition that Metro's in, all those things would seem to be a hindrance to making this a more global city.
I would say it certainly is an impairment, but I don't think that it's a barrier that really is stifling our ability to grow the city and grow the economy through innovation. It hurts. It makes it a little less attractive for people to live here, but we have a whole lot of other opportunities that can overcome that kind of thing.
I would add that there isn't much. If you look at transportation, it is arguably the ugliest part of the picture, whether it's airports, mass transit, roads. It's hard to imagine it being less effective because of the tri-jurisdiction. And traffic could, and congestion could kill the golden goose if we don't get our arms around that. I think though, getting back, that I think the identification by, again, I believe the business community of what the essentials for success are. Again, I think that a lot of the necessity for regional coherence, frankly, has never been held up as a requirement for growth before, and global growth or attracting the creative class or whatever the requirement is. And I think the voice for that has to come out of the business community. The business community has historically been so focused on the federal government as a customer base, it's largely taken for granted, I think, its ability to do business outside of that, whether it's globally or domestically. And so it's given, frankly, I think, pretty much a free ride to the region's leadership, whether it's taking care of its universities, building a coherent transportation system, a business environment where you can start new businesses without 19 different steps in the process. But the requirements have to be defined, and frankly, business is the only point that really can make that point stick. Again, everyone else is sort of in the service to role, and I think it's another reason why this has a lot of value. It's difficult because if you're in San Diego or you're in Boston, you have a fairly unified governmental support base and maybe even in some circumstances leadership. That isn't going to be in our lifetime part of this equation, but business can fill that gap, I think, quite effectively.
All right, I think we have time for one more question. So, yeah, we'll go, sir, right there.
Hi, my name is Zach Comis. I'm actually in the econ program at GW and also affiliated with the Roosevelt Institute. So universities and hospitals can undeniably play a really important role in research and workforce development in the district. But local anchors themselves also spend $5.7 billion per year on goods and services. So as we talk about diversifying the revenue streams of local businesses, what can anchors themselves do, like GW and Inova, to support local procurement?
I'll have a shot quickly. I think the role that was mentioned earlier of being the connector we see a big part of what we're going to try to do on our new personalized medicine, personalized health campus, which is the old ExxonMobil headquarters, 120 acres right on the Beltway, is to bring people together in two dimensions, be the connector. As a practical matter around life sciences, it takes usually basic science, translational scientists, but businesses to work with those researchers, and then a clinical base to apply the new test, drug, device, or whatever it is. That role that we can play as a connector to bring a university together with a company is looking to develop a new piece of technology with either a healthy population or a patient population. That connectivity is often what's missing when the pieces are all over the map. I think that's the way we see the connector role being vital to that process.
That's really key. I mean, business is all about relationships, and as long as we don't know each other, then it's going to be hard to build that ecosystem. So when we start to have that connector role fulfilled, then a lot of the smaller companies like mine will have an avenue for creating those relationships, understanding the needs of the larger players in the region, and being able to fill them. So.
All right, well, I just want to thank our panel. You guys did a great job. Thank you so much, and thank you all for your time and attention.